People who almost died, but lived because of a gut decision. What's your story? I was traveling in the Philippines in northern Luzon. That's the part that always hits hard by the typhoons. It was just the beginning of rainy season. I was in Banaway and was planning to go up north to Sagada the next Saturday. The Lonely Planet writes about this route as the scariest road in the world. It's solid mountain on one side and deep, deep, deep on the other. There was a jeepney scheduled in the morning and one in the afternoon. Everyone who knows me knows that I'm not a morning person, and if there is a later option, I'm definitely taking this one. On a whim the night before, I decided to leave earlier and take the 8 a.m. Jeep. Super out of character for me, and I'm still not sure why I did it. A few days later, on another bus, I chatted with this nice lady, and she asked me what places in the Philippines I've been to so far. And she says, "Oh my gosh, have you heard about the jeepney accident on Saturday afternoon on the road from Banaway to Sagada?" So apparently the jeepney I planned to take came upon a mountain slide, lost control, and went down the side of the mountain. 10 people died, and no one survived. Wow, I mean, that's really lucky for this guy, but still super terrible. Also, I'm sure I butchered those names a bit there. I tried my best. I looked them up. Story 2. Mid-1990s. Traveled to northern New Jersey with a friend from college. It was his hometown. We had plans to visit New York City and see a former roommate who graduated the year before, friend number 2. Well, apparently friend number 2 dabbled in low-level organized crime since his last years in college. We had some knowledge of this, but were not involved. He invited us to an associate's house with plans to go out afterward. We declined. Not our scene. In fact, both of us had applied to law school. I planned to pursue a career in federal law enforcement thereafter. We both wanted distance from that nonsense. We tried the following day to reach our friend number 2 for a low-key lunch before heading out to town. But there was no answer. Well, local police found his body 2 days later, along with 2 other bodies at the house he invited us out to. He was murdered at the meeting and the social situation, and it would have been us too. I knew that was bad news. Story 3. I was out late one night. My car had broken down in the middle of an interchange that was so deserted there was no one there for miles. I did what any other person would do and called a towing number. And when I finally got through, it was almost 1 a.m. I decided to go take a leak down at some bushes when suddenly I heard some bikes approaching the car. I wanted to head out immediately to stop them for help when my legs froze and I thought twice. From behind the bush I was at, I basically saw them try to ransack the car, and apparently they were all armed. Thank goodness, for whatever reason, I remained still. Because these guys meant business, they fired multiple shots into the windscreen and the door. It was an old Toyota, so there was nothing there. They busted all 4 wheels with bullets before getting back on their bikes and zooming off. I believe they were all high AF, which was why they didn't bother to check around, or maybe they thought I just deserted that area. Long story short, I walked a bit further into an open field and sat on the thick branches of a tree where I could see approaching objects. The towing truck didn't get there until past 4 a.m. in the morning, and I can tell y'all, that was the longest night of my life. I did make it home in one piece though. Story 4. I had a weird feeling something was seriously wrong with me when I stood up and almost passed out at a big football game. We left the stadium and went to the ER. Turns out my appendix was ruptured and I needed surgery ASAP. I had been having stomach pain prior to this, but brushed it off as digestion problems. Good thing I went. Edit. We were watching the Cotton Bowl in Texas. My wife got me tickets for Christmas as the college game we went to were playing that year, and we are from Michigan, so we had quite the drive to get to Texas. My appendix ruptured in the 3rd quarter, and I ended up finishing the game in the hospital. We stayed a few extra days, but I had to get back to college, so my wife drove 17 hours straight, and we had to get out of the car every 45 minutes to an hour or so. I could walk around to avoid the blood clotting. She was my fiance at the time, and this trip really made us stronger, and I knew we would have a happy marriage. Thanks for all the well wishes. Story 5. I'm not sure I would have died, but my gut kept me from being essayed. Unfortunately, my friend didn't listen to me and suffered for it. I grew up in a small town who contracted a construction project to a company in Norway. At the local bar one night was a group of Norwegian men who were staying at a local hotel. My friend and I met them that night for the first time. We hung out with them for a few hours and they showered us with drinks all night. As closing time came, they invited us to continue the party at their hotel. I pulled my friend aside and I told her we should not go. We didn't really know them, and we were also outnumbered. She said it would be fun, it's no big deal. But my gut told me no, I didn't feel comfortable, and so I refused. Well, she called me a buzzkill and just went anyway. The next day she called me screaming. She spent the night being essayed by these creeps, and in her devastation she blamed me for not going with her. I tried to comfort her and I begged her to let me call the cops, but she refused and said she just never wanted to see me again. This was a couple decades ago, long before Me Too, and I didn't know what to do. One of my biggest regrets is not calling the cops or banging down her door and trying to offer her comfort. What I don't regret is not going with her. She can be mad at me, but I couldn't have saved her. We would have both been essayed. I moved away shortly after and I've never seen her again. I wonder if there is anything I should do now. I just don't know what that would be. She was dead set on blaming me, but I tried to tell her it wasn't safe. I really did. I felt crazy, but the decades have helped me come to terms that I guess it really wasn't my fault. I don't think I made that clear, but I felt I should add it because it is the truth. Story 6. While fishing on a large lake in Canada, we were a little more than halfway across when the wind really started picking up and a storm started rolling in. I had the choice to turn back or head to an island with a bay. I decided to head for the bay, and just as we reached the calmer water, we looked behind us, and the storm had gotten worse, much worse. We were in an aluminum boat, and if we had chosen to head back, 3 of us would have drowned, no doubt in my mind. We were already taking on water and were completely drenched when we beached on the island. Once the storm abated, we made the journey back, and it still took 4 hours in high wind for a normally half-hour boat trip. Warming up in the truck was the best feeling in the world after that. Story 7. When I was 12 years old, I went to stay back in my hometown. We had moved to a town 3 hours away with a friend and his family. They rented canoes and we trailered them to a spot in the Cedar River. We were going to put these canoes in and float back into town and get off the river before the multiple low-head dams that are part of the downtown Charles City, Iowa. This was in 1993, the year of the massive floods. Other rivers were already out of their banks across the Midwest. The Cedar River had been less affected, but on this day, it was flowing by at an alarming rate. I had broken my arm a couple weeks prior and I was in a cast. As they prepared to launch these canoes, I began to protest. I didn't want to get in the river. A guy that was camping nearby approached and asked what we were doing. He said the river had come up several feet since he had woken up, and that my friend's parents were fools to try and get in. They dismissed him, but I continued to refuse. Eventually, a park ranger arrived and said that even if we made it to Charles City, we'd never get off the river and would be killed at the first dam. They finally reloaded the canoes, but they were so upset at me for being such a coward. But I think I saved us all. The river came out of its banks that day and flooded Charles City. Story 8. In 2019, the Gilroy Garlic Festival had an attempted mass shooting. A kid came walking through the trees and a fence line with an AK-47 drum mag attached and TO extended clips on his hip. Where he entered the park was roughly 20 feet away from the booth I was working. The guy was so close to us when he first entered that we didn't see the gun at first. We heard the click of him shoving the drum mag in and cocking it, but me and 4 other friends were in this booth. I heard the click sound. At the same time, my buddy notices the gun. In what is to this day the quickest reaction of my life, we looked at each other and tackled our friends out of their chairs. My buddy, the glorious genius idiot that he is, within 2 seconds realized there was no way for us to get up and out without being in the line of fire, so he grabs the girls and tells them to crawl on their stomachs to the woods 10 or so feet away from us. The instant he told them that, me, him, and our buddy all kind of understood together. It was one of those make a move or die situations. So the second the girls started crawling, we took the pop-up tent that was above us and tipped it over so that it gave us a slight cover to run away, which we immediately did as fast as we could. I took no bullets, but absolutely felt them flying past us. I heard them hitting stuff. My boy who got the girls to crawl away took a ricochet to the butt, and my other buddy broke his ankle running away. But F me if those 30 seconds weren't the quickest thinking we all had ever done in our lives. Later speaking on it, we realized that none of us mentioned flipping the tent or running. We hadn't discussed anything, we just kind of knew instinctually what to do. Story 9. When I was 18, I left for some missions group thing for my gap year. This took place on an island in Central America. Earlier that night, everyone had been swimming off the dock, but I didn't want to do it because of all the jellyfish. As this is a group of guys fresh out of high school, this decision earned me the title of Huge Coward. Later that night, I go back down to the docks, just thinking about stuff. Because I want to be alone, Obviously, I creeped out of the house without telling anyone, and I see the water and think, wow, no one is around to judge me. I should get over my fear. Quit being a coward. I'm going to jump in the water. But for some reason, I hesitate for only a moment, and I shine my flashlight on the spot that I want to jump to. There's this weird, clear, worm-looking thing I've never seen before. It's not exactly swimming. It's like twitching erratically, gently moving with the water. I'm wondering, what the heck is this? When I look around more, I see a box of jelly and a missing tentacle, and the tentacles look exactly like the worm. The box jellies there weren't like the kinds in Australia, where you get hit and you're dead, but these were apparently bad enough to send you into shock with the pain. And if I had been in the water with no one else around to find me, there's a very good chance I would have drowned if I just finally jumped in to get over my fear without checking. Edit. Feel like I should clarify that when the other guys were swimming, there were not box jellies around, just a normal kind that mildly stung you and didn't do much else. Story 10. Me and two friends were on MDMA and pretty drunk. It was common for us to drunk walk home from downtown. While walking home, we walked past a house about 2 blocks away from the house we all rented together. There were about 6 guys hanging out on the stoops of this house. They wanted to talk, and my drunk, high friends were all too happy to stop and talk with them. After a few minutes of talking, they invited us in for a few extra beers. I had a bad feeling about them, so I didn't want to go inside, but my 2 friends wanted to go and shoot the crap. I convinced my friends that we should go home and get my drugs. We can smoke it there. After getting home, being high, they mostly forgot and were easily convinced to not venture back out just to smoke with these random guys. We found out that 2 days later, 2 guys got invited into that same house and were robbed, essayed, and beaten to death by those 6 men. There was not a doubt in my mind that that was exactly what awaited us inside that house. They saw 3 drunk and high guys and figured easy pickings. But being guys in a relatively safe city, we just didn't have the fear we should have about walking into a random house, especially so close to home. Story 11. Early on in my alcoholism, I didn't know that withdrawals were a thing, or that they could kill you. At one point, I was drinking 2/5 of vodka a day. Considering that my life was falling apart, I decided one day to not drink. Big mistake. At first, I thought I was just having a bad hangover. My heart was racing, even though I wasn't moving around. I was shaking, hallucinating, going numb all over, and began wondering if I should go to the hospital. By the time I got there, my heart was beating about a 170 per minute while at rest. The doctors acted very quickly, and I just remember being surrounded by people, them stripping me, shoving an IV into my neck, and yelling, "He's gonna seize!" After the first seizure, I was so messed up they kept hitting me with Ativan over and over because it wasn't working fast enough. Later on, in the ICU, the docs told me I shouldn't be alive and that they gave me enough Ativan to put down an elephant. When I think about what would have happened had I not gone to the hospital, it makes me sad that I wasn't more educated on the dangers of quitting drinking cold turkey. Story 12. In high school at a graduation party, I had a really bad feeling about the guy me and my friends had gotten a ride there with. I'll call him H. I didn't know him well, but I saw him drinking and wasn't sure how much. He was supposed to be our ride home when the party was over. My one friend said she trusted him and not to worry. Well, I couldn't tell myself not to worry like she could. I said again to her that I didn't think it was safe to drive home with him. She insisted it was fine. Meanwhile, I had made a new friend that night. The first time I saw him, I felt like I should talk to him. Turns out he drove there alone and was staying sober to drive home. By 5 a.m., everyone was talking about grabbing an after-party coffee and some snacks. People were piling into cars. I told my friend one last time I wouldn't drive with H. I got in the car with my new friend, knowing he was 100% sober. We pulled out onto the country road as it snaked through the trees. H came speeding out and passed us way too quickly. As we drove around the next corner, we went through a cloud of dust and debris. H's car was wrapped around a telephone pole. 2 of the 4 passengers were dead, including the kid who got in the seat I would have been. My friend was alive but has permanent injuries to this day. Edit. I appreciate everyone listening to my story. Please don't drink and drive. Please help your friends realize how much damage it can cause. Story 13. Was driving at the speed limit of 70 miles an hour on the highway that I drove daily to go home from work. This particular day, there was an event downtown that had the traffic completely stopped for miles. There was an S-bend in the road though, so you couldn't tell until you were nearly on top of it. I tried to brake, but nothing happened. My brain broke and I kept slamming on the brake pedal, but nothing was happening. I was in the left lane of a 4-lane highway with very little time to spare before I nearly hit the wall of cars in front of me. Left shoulder of the road was barely wide enough for a bike, and cars were coming up on the on-ramp on the right side. I noticed a small gap in between the cars on the on-ramp, but it was in front of me, so I actually sped up to sneak through that gap and onto the grass beside the highway. At one point, I was over 85 miles an hour, knowing I had no brakes in order to get through that gap. I barely made it, and eventually slowed down to stop on the grass. I called my friends to come help, and when they showed up 45 minutes later, I was still clutching the steering wheel with white knuckles and staring straight ahead. It's a miracle that I walked away from that without a scratch. Story 14. A few years ago, I had a cold that was just not getting better over the course of a week. I was exhausted all the time, taking time off work because the incessant coughing made me puke a couple of times. And just overall, I felt worse than I had in years. One night, I realized I was having pain in my chest while breathing. Generally, that's a seek medical help immediately kind of thing, but it was already getting late and I would have to drive myself to the hospital. I'm the only one with a license in my house, so I decided to wait until the next morning. I didn't want to make a huge fuss or have people worry about me, and I thought going to the ER for just a cold would waste hospital resources and my own money. But as I laid in bed trying to sleep, I suddenly started getting extremely anxious about my condition. It shouldn't hurt that much just to breathe. I told my partner I was going to the hospital just to be safe, and we both hopped in the car. Double pneumonia. I was only in the hospital a couple of days after that, but it could have killed me if it went untreated. I don't want to think about what would have happened if I went to bed that night. Basically, the lesson I got from it was hospital bills and possibly bothering people are better than risking death. I've been far more adamant with myself and others about seeking care after this experience. That is a very good lesson, actually, for anybody listening. I've known a lot of kind-hearted people like that, and one, we appreciate you. But two, don't stress so much about being inconsiderate that you don't take care of yourself. I'm sure the doctors and nurses appreciate you, but it is their job to save lives, and they can't do that if you don't show up. Story 15. Back when I was about 18, I had been in this phase where I hadn't worn a seatbelt for a couple of years because it would give me really bad anxiety and it made me sick and I would have to use the restroom. It had probably been about 3 years since I had worn one, but this day I was going to drive to visit a friend from college, and I decided, you know what, time to break this mental roadblock. So I put the seatbelt on for some reason. About 15 minutes into my drive, I hit a busy road, and I always hit it on my way to work as it takes me to the interstate. I'm in the right lane, in a Mitsubishi Galant, a Ford Explorer in the left lane, and we're both going 60 because, well, that's the speed limit. And this little Honda darts in front of the SUV to turn onto the road. The Explorer tries not to hit it and swerves into my lane, which causes me to swerve as a knee-jerk reaction, except I swerve into the grass over a bumpy patch and flip my car 3 times. It was bad. I saw blood running down my arm and glass embedded in it. Everything hurt. My brain hurt. The whole works. Witnesses told the cops what happened, as did the SUV driver, and I concurred with them. My car looked like an empty can someone tried to crush sideways. An ambulance came, but I declined as I just had my parents take me to the ER. Yeah, another person not wanting to get hit with a huge ambulance bill. They spent 2 hours digging glass out of my arm from it going through the windshield and making a perfect hole, which surprised me because I thought windshields were supposed to pop out or some crap. No stitches needed, just badly bruised and sore. Parents were so upset at me for totaling the car because they had just taken off the gap on it only a couple days prior. Needless to say, I think I would have been thrown from the car and killed had I not been wearing the seatbelt. Edit. Someone pointed out that putting gap insurance helped them out and made me realize I meant to say they took it off. Story 16. I don't know if it was a gut decision so much as just being knowledgeable and acting, but still I think it's a pretty wild instance of a near-death experience. My family and I were on holiday in Thailand over the Christmas period years ago, and were staying in a hotel close to the beach in Phuket. I was only 7, and my 2 brothers were even younger. We had been bugging my parents to go jet skiing for days on end, much to my parents' annoyance. but on Boxing Day they finally relented. After breakfast, we went down to the beach to have a look around for somewhere to find a jet ski rental. But before any of that could happen, my dad, a surfer of many years, saw the tide receding in a way that was completely unnatural and recognized the coming tsunami. We thought he was full of it, but he was deadly serious, so we raced back to the hotel where we considered running for the hills. But on the consultation of another couple that recognized the impending disaster, decided to sit tight in our building, which was relatively short and stout. Plus, we were on the top floor. Sure enough, the tsunami came and bulldozed Phuket, although it only destroyed the lobby of our building. We were safe. I have no doubt we all would have died if my dad hadn't known the early signs of a tsunami. We were also on another island a couple days before that, and if we had been there on Boxing Day instead, we might as well have died too. Just an all-around crazy experience that I'm lucky to have made it out of. Story 17. Was surfing while exhausted. My board strap came unvelcroed and my board floated away. I'm swimming to shore, but at one point I hit that tired state where the current is stronger than I am swimming and I realize I am not moving towards shore anymore. I panic, which doesn't help my swimming at all. Suddenly, I remember the surf instructor saying there was a reef far out from shore, but whatever you do, don't stand on it unless you want really bad coral cuts. But I was so panicked, I thought, what the heck, maybe the reef is there. So I kind of just stood up in the middle of the water. My foot hit something, the reef, I assume, and I was able to stand there with my head barely above wave height and rest. Once I got my strength back, I swam back to shore and have not gone surfing since. Edit. Many kind people are sharing their true near-drowning experiences while surfing in nasty waves. They are the true near-drowning while surfing survivors. Rather embarrassingly, I should say the waves were not very big where I was at. I was very near drowning, but mainly from exhaustion. I had played a 3-day tournament just before and had been surfing for hours. And not knowing how to manage the smallish waves I was in, I'd only swam in pools and rivers before this experience. For me, the near drowning was very much an open water near drowning more than a surfing near drowning. Story 18. In 2016, my wife and I were in Berlin to explore and visit the Christmas markets. The plan for that evening was to go out to eat and then get the train back to stop into the markets at Breitscheidplatz, as it was close to our hotel. This had been the plan for the entire trip, as it was the last night. We had finished our meal and were headed to the train station. Just as we were about to board the train, my wife decided that she didn't want to go to the markets at Breitscheidplatz and would prefer to double back to a smaller one we had passed on the walk from the restaurant to the station. I, being a stubborn idiot, didn't want to change the plans. But she got her way and we headed back, staying at the smaller market for about 30 minutes. After finally getting the train back, we got off and walked towards our hotel. After a minute or so, there appeared a seemingly never-ending stream of emergency vehicles. Not knowing what was going on, but obviously something serious, we sped up and locked ourselves in the hotel room. We had the English language 24 news channel on, and after about an hour, reports started to come through about a terrorist attack. A man had driven a truck into a crowd at the Breitscheidplatz market. Obviously, I'll never know if we would have been in the exact spot, but we definitely would have been there at the same time. And I am never allowed to complain about my wife changing her mind ever again. Story 19. A few years back, my ex-boyfriend and I were coming home from work. I had to stop at a gas station to fill up to make it home. It was super late, and my boyfriend goes, "It's like 2 a.m. I'm hungry. There's a Waffle House down the street. You want to go? I don't want to cook when we get home." I didn't want to cook either, so I agreed. I sent my parents a text saying, "Hey, we're getting food," and gave them the address, which is something I don't normally do, being that they lived across the country, but I felt the need to let them know where we were. We pull up to the Waffle House, and I immediately didn't feel comfortable. I told my boyfriend I didn't like the vibes, and he agreed. And he didn't want waffles anymore, so he just wanted to go home. Next morning, I wake up to both our phones ringing, at least 30 missed calls. Text from my cousins, missed FaceTime calls from friends and family. I called my mother back and could barely make out her words because she's hysterically crying, but she finally yelled, "My baby is alive!" to my dad. Confused as heck and half asleep, I asked her what was going on. She told me to turn on the TV. I turn on the news and see the Waffle House we're going to stop at with the headline, "Nashville Waffle House Shooting." And I haven't stopped at a Waffle House since. Story 20. Mine wasn't a gut feeling, rather it was a dream. I grew up in the country on several acres of woods and creeks. I loved any and all animals. I was obsessed. I would bring all manner of critters home and put them in an aquarium to observe before releasing them back where I found them the next day. One day I found a water snake near the creek, so of course I brought it home and put it in the aquarium, and that night I had a dream. I was reading our local newspaper and the headline said a young girl had died after a venomous snake had escaped an enclosure and bitten her, except it was my name printed in the paper along with the day's date. I jolted awake in a cold sweat and immediately took the entire aquarium outside and put it by the tree line before flipping the lid open and booking it back inside. The next day at school during library, I looked up a book about snakes, pre-internet days, and there was a picture of the snake I had brought home. Not the harmless water snake I had thought, but a water moccasin, aka cottonmouth, a snake that could have very easily killed a young child. So yeah, looking back, I realized how utterly stupid I had been and how easily it could have gone terribly wrong. Or maybe nothing would have happened, and I'm just making a big deal of a scary dream. I don't know, but I like to think something was watching out for me that night. Story 21. Spouse and I came back home to our apartment late after traveling. We were both exhausted but made the somewhat weird decision on the way back to stop at the grocery store and get steaks to make dinner. There was an alarm going off in the house, but we couldn't find it and decided to just eat. Warning sign. Bad decision number 1. In the time that it took us to cook and eat the steaks, we both started to feel very odd and would see a kaleidoscope every time we closed our eyes. By this point, we were both realizing that it was carbon monoxide, but instead of leaving the house, we opened all the windows and laid down on the couch to go to sleep. I remember lying there, all snuggled up and thinking, this isn't such a bad way to die, really. That thought shot me out of it, and I immediately got up and forced my partner out of the house. And by immediately, I mean I got up and forced them up. And then we both sort of weirdly puttered around for another half hour because carbon monoxide makes you forget how to behave. I packed a bag for us, and that was like half of our clothes because I couldn't think straight. Sat in the car together and realized we had to call a cab because we couldn't read any of the road names in our neighborhood. Had a horrible headache, I was nauseous, dizzy, and had chest pain for the next 2 days. Moral of the story, get a carbon monoxide detector for every room in your house, especially bedrooms, living rooms, and kitchens. Carbon monoxide is really scary and silent, and it will kill you in your sleep. Story 22. In labor with my daughter. I only have the one child, so it was my first labor and I had no idea what to expect really. All was fine, I was progressing slowly but surely, minimal pain relief needed. Then there was a shift change. My new midwife just wanted it over with. She was clearly bored and kept offering to break my waters. I said no several times. My ex went to update the waiting grandparents, and while he was gone, she decided to check how things were going. She asked to break my waters. I said no. She kept her hand inside while I was having a contraction and kept asking me. I have no idea if I said yes or not. I just remember blinding pain, so possibly I said yes to make her stop whatever she was doing. But after that, things went fast. I was in so much pain and couldn't figure out what my body was doing. It just didn't feel right. I kept asking her to check on me, to check on the baby, and she wouldn't. By this point, my ex had come back and he was asking her to check, and she just said it wasn't time yet. I screamed my head off. I screamed and screamed for help until another midwife popped her head around the door to ask if everything was okay. My midwife said yes, but I shouted, "No, please check on my baby." New midwife hesitated slightly, as she'd be disrespecting a colleague, but ultimately decided to check me. She did a 30-second check and looked at my ex and said, "Press the red button, now." With that, the surgeon came in and I was rushed off for a C-section. As I was being stitched up, it was explained what the emergency was. My body was trying to push. I was, without knowing it, fighting the urge to push. I was only 3 centimeters dilated. My daughter was in distress. There was no oxygen in the cord blood. My instincts, plus the new midwife's instinct to listen to me instead of her colleague, saved both mine and my daughter's life. And I'm forever thankful to her. Story 23. I'm pretty sure I've told this before, but when I was 12, I started getting allergy shots. It's a 5-year program where you gradually build up immunity. Supposedly, after 5 years, your body will no longer attack those allergens. And the way they do it is to start with a really tiny dose and build up over the course of many months. You get to a peak level and then stay there for a while. And then you start over at a low level and get to a peak level over time, etc., etc. Anyway, when I was 16, so I was 4 years into this program, I got my shots, and it was at the peak level, which I had been at for a while. You are required to stay 15 minutes in case of a reaction, and then you can go. My dad was with me, and after the 15 minutes were up, he said we could go. I felt fine, but had this moment where I suggested we just wait 5 more minutes. Within that time, I started having trouble breathing. Side note, often during the visits, they'd have me blow into a tube hooked up to a computer to check my lung strength or capacity or something, I don't know. It was synced to a Three Little Pigs animation, and the harder you blew, the more houses would fall down. It was good if you could get the brick house down. So we tell the doctor that I'm having a hard time breathing. They take me to the lung test, and I can't even get the first house down. They rush me to a bed. They're checking my blood pressure, which is going down fast. They put me on oxygen and do 2 shots of epinephrine, an adrenaline-type shot that gets your heart pumping. They told my dad to call my room because they weren't sure if I'd make it. Turns out I did make it, and I'm not allowed to get allergy shots anymore. And since I was only 4 of the 5 years, my allergies are still here, and it's as annoying as ever. But that's my story of how I almost died, but survived almost solely because I stayed longer than I needed to, even though I had the opportunity to leave. Had we left, I would have been a couple miles away from the clinic, and who knows if there would have been time to get back or know what was wrong. Story 24. I was driving on a 1-lane highway, the kind that has 1 lane each way. I was behind a very old clunker of a car going 60 miles in an 80 miles an hour zone. The dude in the car leaned out his arm from the window and waved me on. They actually even veered a bit to the right towards the shoulder as well and slowed down. They gave me a very reasonable indication that they were going to let me pass. Traffic from the incoming side was clear. We're in a dashed line zone, so I start passing. Out of nowhere, this old clunker starts taking a left turn across the lane that I'm now passing in. I think the arm wave was their stupid attempt at signaling that they were going to take a left. I almost hit them at 80 miles an hour and T-boned. I would have probably died, and they almost certainly would have given the age of the tin can they were in. I hit my brakes as best as I could while maintaining control and then veered to the right. I narrowly missed them. Honestly, the reaction was pure instinct. It happened within a second or so, and I'm still surprised that I pulled this off. Story 25. I was 14 and on holiday in Greece with family. I got ill with either sunstroke or food poisoning. It's the same symptom, so it's hard to tell. And I spent 4 days not being able to hold down any food or water whilst being very sick. Even a teaspoon of water would result in me throwing up 10 times that amount, but of bile. So that morning my parents said they wanted to take me to the hospital, but I felt fine. I just couldn't hold down food and water and really didn't want to go. So I said if I'm still sick tomorrow, then I would go. So they left for the beach and I stayed behind at the apartment. But as my dad got to the bottom of the stairs, he had a strange feeling that things didn't feel right. So he came back up in an instant with my mom and they took me to the hospital, which I was admittedly very angry about. We waited roughly an hour in the waiting room, then got seen. We explained the situation and the nurses checked my veins and then asked me if I had any pains or aches coming from my organs, which I did. After this, they started rushing around really quick to get me on an IV drip. It took 12 attempts to get the IV in, and after I was hooked up for an hour and they knew I was safe, they explained that my veins had collapsed. Why it took 12 attempts to get the IV in, and then that aching feeling from my organs was them starting to shut down. If I had arrived at the hospital a couple hours later, I would have died. So basically, if my dad didn't get this strange feeling when he left, I would have died in that apartment. There's a Through the Wormhole episode which has an explanation about what happened to me, I believe. If you want to watch it for yourself, the episode is There a Sixth Sense? It's season 3 or 4, I think. Story 26. South Minneapolis, 1986. Middle of summer. My girlfriend and I were new to the city, having come from a very small town. We lived in a small apartment building that had no security doors. There were only 8 units and we lived on the top floor, very unsafe. There had been a string of murders in the area at that time as well. We were fast asleep, middle of the night with the fan blasting on high, when suddenly there was a loud banging on our door. I opened the door to see the police asking if we were okay. Yeah, why? There had just been a man at our door trying to break in. He fit the description of the murderer in the area. He had a crowbar in his hand wrapped in a towel. The only thing that saved us was blind luck. Since our building had no security doors, the woman who lived across the hall from us, a nurse, would have the lady who lived below us walk up to our apartment with her. One would take the front stairs, the other would take the back stairs. When she got to the foot of the stairs, she saw the guy at our door. "What are you doing?" she asks. seeing the crowbar in his hands. "Oh, I am here to see the girl who lives here," he says as he steps towards her slowly. At that moment, the lady from downstairs came from the other set of stairs, and it frightened the guy. He ran away. This incident has haunted me for years. It was only by luck that we were saved. If that guy would have gotten into our unit, we would have been in big trouble. It is only because the nurse came home at that very moment that nothing happened to me. We moved out shortly thereafter, and I'm quite sure that I saw that apartment unit on the news a few months later. The lady who lived below us was attacked, and I think she died. I can't remember for sure, but I'm sorry for the long story. Glad to finally share it with someone after all these years. Story 27. About 10 years ago, my mom and I stopped at Taco Bell for lunch. I was driving and she was the passenger. I parked my pickup truck with my front end facing the street in front of an electrical post. I thought we were eating in, but my mom said no, let's order to go. She told me what she wanted and that she'd wait for me in the truck. For some reason, I just did not want to leave her there. I was insistent that she come in with me. "What if I get the order wrong?" I said. "Come on, just come in with me." Mind you, I was like 20 or 21 at the time, plenty old enough to go into a restaurant and order on my own, but something just told me she had to come too. She finally relented and came in with me. I had just barely finished placing the order when I heard a strange sound outside behind me. The cashier taking my order looked outside right after returning my debit card and says, "Wow, that crash looks bad." I turned around, and it turns out that a drunk driver at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday zoomed down the wrong side of the road and slammed into the post I was parked in front of. The driver died on impact. The post collapsed and crushed the cab of my truck on the passenger side. Needless to say, I lost the pickup truck, but I got to keep my mom. Story 28. When I was 7 or 8 years old, we lived in the jungle area of Franklin Park, Illinois. At the end of our first 747 runway in the late 1960s, early 70s, when the 747s went over blotted out of the sun and you couldn't hear anything over the engine roar for a full minute. Planes are a lot quieter these days if you didn't know. It was all apartments, and it was well known for pimps and drugs and factories. My brother and his friend and I were playing by a factory that was being built out of cement blocks. My brother and his buddy made a fort out of some blocks, and they found a piece of plywood to act as a top. One afternoon, a serious storm started to blow in, and I knew there were tornado warnings. They wanted to stay in the fort for the storm because it would be really cool, but after a very loud and close lightning strike, I left and ran for our apartment. The storm lasted under 45 minutes, and the wind and thunder were terrible. My brother never came home, so afterward I went looking for him. One of the walls of the factory that was under construction had collapsed and had fallen on our fort. It was flat as a pancake. I walked around trying to see if they were there, but there didn't seem to be any smashed kids. Then I went home where my brother had just shown up, and he said they had gone to his friend's apartment after I left. I took him to see our fort, and we just kind of never talked about it again. Story 29. I was up in the mountains snowboarding with my family. I was at the top of the mountain, my mother at the bottom, having already gone down on her skis and was at the bottom. There was an old broken down fence along the side of the mountain, a very steep drop covered in rocks and ice and trees of the otherwise. People going down around me as I headed down along the fence to the Black Diamond Hill, and there was a child who had tried to go around me, clearly much younger, on their skis. The kid had rammed into the back of me, causing me to go off course towards the broken fence. I fell over, feeling that I had more friction in the snow I wouldn't fly over the edge. I made the right call. I slammed into the fence while laying on my back as my board hung over the side as I desperately held onto the wood and digging my hands into the snow. Thankfully, I didn't fall. Story 30. I have Crohn's and colitis. So severe gut pains were nothing new. I stood up and felt like I was stabbed in the stomach. I went and told my boss I had to go home. By the time I got there, I could barely stand up. My wife insisted I get checked out. She ended up driving, and every single pothole was unbearable. We live on a dirt road 40 minutes away from the hospital. I could barely walk by the time we got there. Turned out I had a ruptured ulcer through both sides, technically a perforated colon. After a week of IV antibiotics, I was released. After a few days at home on antibiotics, I woke up one day feeling terrible. Back to the hospital, the perforation had closed but turned into an abscess. They took this 2-foot needle and stuffed it in through my side to install a drain in the abscess. Spent another week on IV antibiotics while admitted. I was out for a week and had the drain removed, still on antibiotics. A few days later, I woke up sick as a dog and went back to the hospital. I had developed a septic infection. Time for a colon resection. They split me from my pelvic bone to my sternum and removed a little over a foot from my colon. 10 days later, had a PICC line put in for antibiotics and IV nutrients. Another 6 days, I was finally released. I spent 26 days in the hospital and out of work for 4 months. Scar tissue from Crohn's was the cause of the tear. Due to the amount of radiation from all of the scans I'd had, cancer is how I go out. 2 years post-op with an ileostomy, I feel great. Other than the back situation, life is good. In short, a literal gut feeling almost killed me. Story 31. I was kidnapped once. Was heavily into drugs at the time and made some mistakes, upset the wrong people. 2 of the biggest guys I've met were sat on either side of me in the back seat. Cousins of someone I thought was my friend. Someone in the front seat asked to see my phone because his died. He never looked at it. He just put it in the cup holder. They started driving me out of town when it hit me. I started complaining about being thirsty, so I convinced them to take me to a drive-thru. I would buy them drinks, I said. I had to get myself on camera. Luck has it, I knew the gal working the window. I called her by name and the whole car looked at me. They knew they couldn't get it done, so we turned back around and drove back into the city. They dropped me off and let me walk away without my phone. The gut feeling was to lock all my doors and windows when I got home and turn off the lights. They showed up at 1 a.m. again, knocking on my door, trying to turn the knob. Same car, same guys. I never showed them where I lived, so my friend must have shown them. Story 32. Had plans to go to a dance with 2 of my friends and one of the girl's boyfriends. So 4 of us in total. The boyfriend was going to take all of us in his car. At the last minute, I decided to drive myself and just meet them at the dance. I was running a bit late and I really didn't know this guy at all. I just felt more comfortable driving myself in my own car. And that way I could leave whenever I wanted and not have to worry about anyone else's plans. I called my friend to tell her and she was fine with it. We went to the dance and had fun. I ended up leaving a bit on the earlier side because I was called into work for 10 a.m. the next day. They decided to stay later. Neither of my friends were in school on Monday, which I thought was weird. Long story short, they were in a serious accident on their way home from the dance and were home recovering from their injuries, which is why they weren't in school. They were driving on a main street and a car coming from a side street didn't stop and T-boned them. The main impact of the hit is exactly where I would have been sitting had I gone with them. As it was, they were all injured. Thankfully, it was nothing life-threatening, ultimately, but one of my friends sustained permanent damage to one of her eyes. The other fractured her wrist. The boyfriend, who was driving, had only bumps and bruises, but his car was totaled. Story 33. I was almost 37 weeks pregnant last August, and I was feeling a bit run down, super tired, had a hard time keeping food down, and just, tired. I did have occasional pain in my right side, but it was random, and I thought it was just my daughter kicking me. I didn't want to go to the doctor, but my husband and father-in-law talked and decided to convince me to go in. My father-in-law said he just had a gut feeling that I needed to go and get checked out, so I agreed. I was high risk and had some complications like gestational diabetes plus a previous pregnancy loss. We called the hospital and the doc said to go ahead and come in. We went in and the doc had some blood drawn and they checked my vitals. Blood pressure normal, normal temp, etc. Well, we waited for the lab test to come back and figured I'd get sent home with instructions to drink more water or something like that. Suddenly, the doc comes back in with 2 other doctors and says they don't want to alarm me, but I need to have a cesarean as soon as possible. As it turns out, I had developed something called HELLP syndrome. It's related to preeclampsia, and basically my liver proteins, which are normally supposed to be in the 10s, were spiked into the thousands. My liver was failing, which explains that pain in my right side. HELP syndrome is extremely rare, but having inconsistent liver pain is even more rare. Because it wasn't consistent, I had thought it was my daughter, and I just ignored it. Because my liver was failing, my kidneys had to step up, but the heavy load was causing them to fail too. Literally, the only thing doctors can do to stop this is to get the baby out ASAP, get some blood thinners in me afterward, and monitor me. So an hour after I got to the hospital, I was being wheeled into surgery. I woke up the next day because they put me under anesthesia. I had lost 4 pints of blood and had to get several transfusions and spent a couple extra days in the hospital. They told my husband while I was sleeping that he had brought me in just in time, that if we waited any longer my organs would have likely failed and my daughter might have died. So my father-in-law's gut feeling saved our lives. My daughter and I are fine now. I've been checked a few times and things are back to normal. No permanent organ damage, and my baby is super healthy. She's spent a week in the NICU because she was born early, but she's totally okay. I was told that if we have another baby, I'll just have to get blood tests weekly to monitor my liver, just in case. Oh man, there's already been a few pregnancy stories. Props to women, dude. I mean, like, that whole experience, I assume, is pretty rough on the body without all the complications. I feel bad. I mean, mothers are soldiers, man. That's it. Everybody go hug your mom. Story 34. Bit of a graphic story. So when I was 15, my family found out I was gay. They flipped the F out. At 3 a.m. on a Saturday morning, they burst into my bedroom screaming and asking, was I gay? I had enough of their bullcrap and said after about 5 minutes of my mother screaming. She started hitting me, but I wouldn't hit her back because after all, she was my mom. I say that I was because we haven't spoken in over a decade. She has the idea of moving because obviously it was the friends that I made. The first time I felt like I had a friend since the divorce took me away from my elementary school and the only friends I had. I refused, and he, my dad, my grandfather was there. They started to grab by the legs and drag me out of the room. I kicked back and made a bolt for the door. My grandfather caught me in the hallway and was strangling me against the wall, and my entire body was off the ground. I kneed him in the gut enough to loosen his grip and break free. I made a bolt for the front door. Mind you, I'm in boxer briefs. We lived outside a little town and it was 3 in the morning. I ran parallel to the main road. I know I was heading towards town. I am lucky I have good night eyes and I grew up running through the woods. I was barefoot in October in Michigan. I knew I couldn't stop at the neighbors because they were friends, so I just kept running. I found a trailer that had a light on. I knew we didn't know them, so I banged on the door screaming for help. The dog woke up and woke them up. It was an elderly couple. They answered the door and called the cops. The cops showed up and I was photographed. The old couple gave me this green and black plaid house robe with some paint stains from painting the house. Once the cops were interviewing me, I discovered because of their photographs that my neck was bleeding. His fingernails dug into my neck so hard it was bleeding. My family spun the entire story that I had started the fight with my mom. It was 5 adults against one 15-year-old. I went to jail until a juvenile holding center opened up the following week for intact. I turned 16 locked up. It was one of the best birthdays of my life. The judge made me go back home with them and told me if I tried to emancipate, he would deny it on grounds that I am unfit to be on my own. I lived under their house, mentally tortured for over a year until I could move out. Everyone called me the worst of names and said the worst of things to me. They wanted me to get violent so they could call the cops again. I had to refrain. It took every ounce of will to not attack them. Every day I went home. It really effed me up, and I have trust issues along diagnosed PTSD. I'd gone through life-changing therapy. Thankfully, when I was 21, I called the self-unaliving hotline. I told them I wasn't wanting to self-unalive, but I couldn't control my thoughts anymore. They got me in touch with a place that does sliding scale fees, and I could afford it while being a screen printer. It changed my life, and it took several years for it to set in. Thanks to the pandemic, my PTSD has resurfaced back to where I was 10 years ago. And the self-unaliving hotline again got me in touch with help. And I'm in a program I can trust, and they want to help. I don't have much in life, and people may think the way I live is odd, but I have a few friends I wouldn't trade for the world. There are sunny days if you put in a little effort. Thank you for all who read this. My family were abusive drug users all my childhood. If you want to know more, just ask. I'm an open book about this because I want others to know that help does exist and that what people do to you is not a reflection of who you are. It is something you can overcome, and overcoming it will determine who you are. Story 35. Not myself that almost died, but my gut instinct saved my dad's life, I think. My parents moved to this very remote cabin miles from the nearest town a few years after I moved out of high school. I was headed back to see them, and my dad was headed home from a business trip a few hours before me. There were two routes to their house, one mostly paved but slightly more roundabout to get there, then a more direct route that was basically dirt roads with multiple turns. This was the middle of the winter, and the dirt roads were snow-packed and icy. With the wind chill, it was about -10 Fahrenheit. I normally liked the paved route better anyway, as it was faster, but at the last second, I turned and took the dirt route. Well, several miles in, I go around a sharp corner that is very icy and see a tiny glint in the ditch about 30 feet below the road. I kept driving, but I had a weird feeling, so I turned around and went back to find my dad's truck, with the roof caved in, laying at the bottom of this ditch. I, of course, freaked out. I ran down into this ditch looking for him, but he wasn't with the truck. I tried to call him, tried to call my mom to see if he was okay, but had no cell signal. I start driving as fast as I could looking for him. I finally get to a spot with one bar and feel service, and get a hold of my mom, who had not heard from him and was worried sick. I kept driving, and finally came upon him walking in the road. He had made it several miles, but he was hypothermic, and he said he was ready to give up. He had a winter jacket on, jeans, and tennis shoes. No closed hat, insulated socks. If anything, if I hadn't taken that road on a whim, I wouldn't have come across his truck, and most likely wouldn't have found him in time. Story 36. A few years ago, I did tackle football, middle school. I sucked at it. I don't know how I didn't get kicked off the team, but practice has just ended. I went to the parking lot to wait for my dad to pick me up. 5 minutes later, he's still not there. I didn't have a phone yet, so I couldn't call him. 10 minutes after that, I'm now the only person there. All the coaches and the kids had left. It was clear that whatever my dad was doing, he wasn't going to pick me up anytime soon. It was winter-ish time, so it was already completely dark and starting to get really cold. So I start walking home. It's a 3-ish mile walk, but I figured I could make it. I walk to the first intersection, recognize it, and I keep walking, and then the next, and then the next. I'm walking, trying to visualize the way home. I find a third intersection and don't remember it at all. Now I start to panic. As far as my mom knows, I'm at my dad's house. Nobody's coming to find me. I'm lost. I sit down and I try to calm down. I go through my options, try to walk back and go the right way if I can find it. Where is it? I could get even more lost. And for all I know, I'm not lost and I'm just not remembering this road due to adrenaline and fear and panic. But what about knocking on one of the doors of the house as I'm walking by? No, everyone is probably sleeping. It's late. And the people that aren't sleeping are probably not going to answer their door to a kid wearing football pads and carrying a helmet. So I do what every parent or guardian has said not to do. I start jumping and waving my hands at all the cars that pass me. Eventually one stops. It just so happened to be the mom of one of my old football friends from last year. After talking to her for a few, I get in, tell her my address, and we drive to my mom's house. I'm not going to go into the details of what happened when I got to my mom's, because there was a lot of crying and thank yous. I'm an atheist, but that night made me think that maybe there is some form of higher power that saved me that night. If it hadn't been my friend's mom in the car, I might have never made it home. Story 38. I used to commute on a motor scooter to and from work via one of the two bridges across our harbor. They were both traffic funnels at rush hour. One summer evening, I was heading up a broad ramp to the bridge when some brightly painted rail cars on the nearby tracks caught my eye. I glanced left for maybe 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, the driver of the second car ahead suddenly discovered the entrance to the Shoreline Park. He dynamited his brakes and put on his left signal. The Buick right in front of me stopped hard to avoid rear-ending him. And when I turned my head back, I was headed straight for him at 60 kilometers an hour, only meters away. My brain did one of those discussions with itself that, in situations like this, can be completed in 0.09 seconds. Bike is toast, right? Agreed. I could end up going into his rear window, or going right over the car, or breaking my neck. True. Do I want to live in a wheelchair? Is that the only option? I'm unsure. Let me get back to you. At this point, another part of my brain yelled at me to shut up, put the bike down. I shoved on the right hand grip and the bike went over and stuck to turn. You know those crazy motorbike racers who lean almost flat to take corners? Well, it seemed you can do that on a Honda scooter if you're desperate enough. Unfortunately, the quick right angle had me looking at a wall of cars in the lane beside us, slammed down on the left handle, another insane turn and a backup right, roaring past the Buick and missing his door handles by a finger's width. I'm alive, unhurt. I let out a huge shuddering breath and drove the rest of the way home like I was on my licensed test ride. Lesson learned in spade. Thank you, brains. You're welcome, you idiot. Story 39. A friend and I were hanging out with her friends about 10 miles from home. My friend drove home early for work early the next day, but a guy promised to drive me home since she was my ride. He kept putting off leaving until like 2 a.m. and then said he was crashing out and would drive me home in the morning. Yeah, right, he wanted me to sleep with him. So I decided to walk home on the back country PA roads alone. By 3 a.m. I am almost to my village when I hear a car coming down the hill toward me. I cross the street because it's a blind curve and I kinda don't want to get hit. The car passes, and as soon as I don't see taillights, I break out into a full run. The road is cut out of the hillside and I'm trapped on the road level. I run far enough to where there's a break in the hillside and double back up the hill through the edge of a field until I'm obscured by the trees. I could hear that the car had turned around and is slow cruising the spot I was just in. Then the guy driving starts calling out, "Hey, little girl, where'd you go? Let me drive you home." He kept it up for over an hour. Drive by, turn around, wait. Drive by, use a flashlight pointing into the field. Call out, turn around, wait. It was super freaking creepy, and I know if I didn't listen to the run that screamed into my head, I would have been fighting for my life instead of hiding. P.S. I crossed the fields and creeks and didn't take another road the rest of the way home. My friend almost killed the guy who was supposed to drive me home, so listen to your inner voice and gut feelings. Story 40. Over a few years ago, a cousin's friend mysteriously disappeared on a boat while visiting his island. His body was never found. What was found was the shorts he was wearing 2 months later. 3 months after that, my cousin's father decided to visit the island. He was from that island too, originally. So me and my cousin decided to tag along, but we couldn't get seats for a seaplane that goes nearby. But luckily, perhaps unluckily, a small boat was traveling to that island. This boat didn't have seats. It was loaded with all sorts of cargo like wood and iron, etc. The weather was really good too. We were all ready for the 4-hour boat ride and nothing was weird. Everything went very well. Around 15 minutes after we set out to sea, the weather became really bad, but we figured it was just a slight rain. But boy, were we wrong. It was raining really heavily nonstop. Sea was super rough and windy as heck. After a while, my cousin's dad went to the toilet, and the captain said to him, "Be careful throwing the bucket into the sea. 3 months ago, some guy was lost on this boat. I think he fell while trying to get some water to clean himself." Yes, we were in the same boat that guy disappeared in, and the weather was so bad on top of it. None of us were particularly scared though, just amazed at the coincidence. We eventually decided to take a nap in the middle of the night, but I was woken up suddenly, and I was floating. Turns out the boat had almost flipped over to one side, and I saw people being flung, and I myself was following headfirst towards the sea, but luckily crashed into a wooden pillar. No one fell, but a lot of us were inches from falling, and we were sure if anyone fell, no one would rescue them in that weather. Not to mention it was the same sea that friend was lost for a few months in. We all decided to keep on going despite it. Some wanted to wait for the storm to pass, but the majority refused. We reached the island 18 hours later. Normally would have taken just 4 hours, but I'm glad we did. The rain didn't stop for a few days, even for an hour. We would have been stuck there with no food if we waited, or maybe capsized due to the weather. It's been years since then, but every time it rains while I'm over or on the sea, I cannot sleep. I still remember waking up floating with the raging ocean right down below my face. Story 41. Believe or disbelieve this story all you want. I'm just going to tell you what happens. And if you want to think it's fake, that's up to you. Believe me, if someone told me this story, then it wasn't something that happened to me. It would be hard to believe. So a friend and I were walking home from school, and we were walking down a main road. We weren't walking down any weird back alleys or anything, and I think it was a Crown Vic. I'm not very good with cars, but I think that's what it was. And I think it was silver, mind you. This was over a decade ago, so this happened. It stopped dead in the middle of the road that we were walking next to, and 5 or 6 Hispanic men jumped out of the car, all dressed like they were going to some formal occasion. They were wearing suits and stuff. They pulled out firearms and pointed them at us. They were speaking in Spanish, and I don't really know much Spanish. But eventually, after what felt like a long time, was realistically probably like 3 or 4 seconds, the driver yells something to the other guys. They all get back in the car and they leave. Now, the decision I made was while this happened, I thought to myself, well, crap, we're out in the open. There's no way to hide. If we just run, they're going to shoot us. So literally, my decision was to just stand there. My only explanation for this was that maybe they were out looking for somebody else, and we just weren't the people they were looking for. Around this time, there was a few deaths in the area that were very suspicious. But yeah, my decision was pretty boring, just to stand in place, because I thought if I ran, I would end up getting shot, because I thought the sudden movement would trigger them to start firing.